The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good afternoon. We're going to start this last session of the intermediate level grant proposal writing course. Today, much like most of your proposals, we're focused on the last section, which will be the budget. Um, Really, today, just a couple things that I want you to know about the budget, and particularly the things that will get you kicked out. Mainly, the budget, even though it's probably one of the most important portions of a proposal, in many of the RFP process that you're going to go through, the budget either may not be scored or is not going to count for a significant number of points. However, if your budget is off, it can often get your entire proposal tossed. So we'll spend some time to make sure that you know how to do a correct kind of budget. And there's two that we'll be looking at: an organizational and a project budget. For the most part, the organizational budget, you have it or you don't. The project budget or the program budget is really what we're going to be focusing on today. And really, to get us started, just to kind of get an idea of where everyone's at, we're going to do a poll. And really, for this poll, the question is which is not a requirement for a budget, particularly in an RFP process. And this is just kind of see where folks are at. Again, which one of these, allowable, allocable, sustainable, or reasonable, is not necessarily a requirement for a budget? Okay, the votes are coming in, and at about 60% of folks voting, we're kind of neck and neck with allocable and sustainable. So as the rest of you vote, and we're going to wrap up this poll in a minute. Okay, we'll go with what we have right now. 15% of you said allowable, 46% of you said allocable, 31% said sustainable, and 8% said reasonable. And actually, the one that is not a requirement is sustainable. And if you think about it, even though most proposals and most RFPs ask for a section on sustainability, they pretty much know that your budget is going to run out. We're going to really talk about the importance of understanding allowable, allocable, and reasonable, because those are the three things that will get you tossed out if you don't do those correctly. So let's just go ahead and get started. Only a few things we're going to do today, and it's really you understand the components of a budget. I want you to have you at least be able to understand what's included in indirect and fringe, and we'll talk about that as well. Sometimes we call that overhead. I do want you to understand the basics of an organizational budget, but also what type of documents funders are going to be looking for. When you're looking at the budget section, there's really only two parts we're really concerned about. That's the actual budget and the budget justification. And both are incredibly important. Most people get the budget down pat, and that's just basically line item cost that you show the funder to show what resources are being used to pay for what. Most folks get that part. Where folks usually get in trouble is the budget justification. And that's the section that actually explains what the actual dollar amounts in your budget mean. For most folks, all they see is a name, maybe, and a dollar figure on a paper, but they don't necessarily know how you calculate it. And now that we're in a time where folks are really starting to scrutinize budgets in terms of looking for efficiency and they're understanding that there's limited resources, having a budget that you can justify is usually the difference between getting the majority of the funding that you're looking for or being cut significantly, if not altogether removed from the process. The big thing I want you to keep in mind with the budget and the budget justification is that you want detail. This is not the time to put down anything miscellaneous or other. Everything in your budget has to have sufficient detail. The bottom line is this: you're asking them for funding, and they expect you to know specifically what you need and how much it costs. That also shows that you're a good steward, and it increases the chances that you will get the majority of your funding. And it's mainly because the budget will show I absolutely need these items to perform these tasks. So again, this is one of the few times where more is actually better. So you definitely don't want to make sure anything's unclear, because anytime anything's unclear, more than likely it's going to get cut. What's the budget? Two things we're looking at. If it's the organizational budget, it's basically the financial picture of your organization. And that's important, particularly for funders that are looking at your capacity. A lot of times, folks will give a projected budget, and most funders are not interested in that. And what I mean by the projected budget, this is what you hope will come in. Now, a lot of budgets do have that factor in some degree. However, even with a budget you place out there, you know where the money's coming from. And there'll tend to be certain funders, or we know from last year that we're going to have this many donors. If you're a new organization, or if you're a relatively young organization and you put a lot of hopes in there, it becomes evident when they look at your organization, because you'll have one staff member, but a $400,000 budget, and folks will know something's wrong. So again, the budget is the financial picture of your organization, and you want to be as honest as possible with it. It's also letting them know what type of cash you need from them and what type of in-kind services you're also going to provide. But the two things is going to answer: what personnel will I need for this project, and what will I need to spend in order to accomplish the goals and objective? And that's why you have to be detailed. The three principles that every budget must adhere to, particularly when we're dealing with federal budgets, but I would say for any budget, is the budget must be reasonable, allowable, and allocable. We'll break down what each of these mean, but these are the three things that can get your budget tossed. And if your budget gets tossed, your proposal gets tossed. So I really want you to keep that in mind. When we're talking about reasonable, again, it's basically what a prudent person would spend. And we'll get more specific. Allowable is exactly how it sounds. Based on the funder's guidelines, they're saying these are the things we will let you spend money on. If you break particularly allowable, the best case scenario for you at that point is that they just may not let you have that portion of your budget, or they may eliminate that part. More than likely what will happen, or worst case scenario, is they'll toss your whole proposal because you're not compliant. And allocable just basically means that I can show that this is an allocation that's going directly to my project or my program. And we'll talk about this shortly. When we're talking about reasonable, and I'll let you see the actual federal OMB guidelines for that part. But here's what you need to keep in mind for reasonable. And I know it sounds funny, but basically, a person in their right mind would make it a similar purchase under the same circumstances. And when you think about that, folks will say, well, what exactly does that mean? Well, let me put it this way. Some folks will ask the question, is a $500 toilet reasonable? Now, some would automatically say, no, you can go to any Lowe's or Home Depot and get a toilet that's less than $500. Why would I spend that kind of money? But perhaps it was a special type of toilet or something you need fitted because you're in a historical building. Or it may be the case of you're trying to become American Disabilities Act compliant. In that case, it may be reasonable under the circumstances. That's what it boils down to. If someone looks at your budget and what you're trying to do, they could say, under these circumstances, it's a reasonable cost. I'll give you another example. If you need laptops, someone may say, well, we need to get Apple computers with the greatest graphics. That may be applicable if you are a design company or if you're doing a program that requires intensive design work. However, if you weren't doing that kind of work and it was just a matter for youth being able to use their homework, then they may say you may not need the top of the line laptop. That's not a reasonable expense under the circumstances. So again, it boils down to you making the justification of why you need these specific items in your budget or at this specific cost. And it's basically saying that it is absolutely necessary for the performance of the project. And more importantly, the cost is consistent with established policies and practices within your organization. Again, it's reasonable to the funder and it's reasonable in terms of your own financial policies and procedures. Allowable tends to be the gut check. And you'll see it adheres to some of the parts of reasonable. But here's what it boils down to. The bottom line is the funder says you can spend money on this particular item. If the funder says this is not something we'll pay for, it doesn't matter what case you make, it doesn't matter what kind of justification you have. If you put that in your budget, the best case scenario is it will be taken out. Worst case scenario, again, your whole proposal could get tossed. And I'll give you an example. On the federal side, it doesn't matter what type of program you run. If it's a program, they're not paying for food. It does not matter if you have an after school program and this is you saying they don't have a meal between now and the time they go home. They'll say, we understand that and we sympathize, but you're going to have to find someone else's dollars to do that with. Either spend your own money or look at another funder. But I'm going to tell you point blank, we will only allow you to spend money on certain items. It also may be a matter of they may say we're not paying indirect or overhead costs. We only want to pay for this program. This is when you have to pay special attention to the RFP because that will lay out all the guidelines in terms of what they will and will not spend anything on. If you violate that, then again, this will get you tossed more likely than anything else. The last one is allocable. And basically all we're saying here is that whatever you are putting in your budget has a sole benefit for this project. The bottom line is, if you look at it this way, if you didn't have this project, you wouldn't need whatever item you had in your budget. With this piece, they're saying, we don't want to pay for anybody else except for the people we are charged to serve in this program. We don't want to pay for any of your other programs. We don't want to pay any of your other expenses. So whatever you put in this budget, they have to see that's an allocation that goes to the direct benefit of anyone participating in this project. The other part is that sometimes you can say it's necessary to the overall operation. And that may be what we call an indirect cost or overhead. But this varies by funder. Some funders will pay for your overhead, some will not. Usually most public funders, whether they're district or federal, a lot of times they will allow for indirect cost or overhead. Most foundations will not. So make sure you keep that in mind as you write your proposals and you do your budget section. Now, what should the budget do? Just a few things. It is basically showing how the resources will be used in terms of what you outlined in your narrative. It goes back to those other parts in terms of showing that it's reasonable, that it's allowable, and it's allocable. But more importantly, it details the cost of your project, and you have to be accurate. Put it this way. If you don't ask for what you need, you're still going to have to find a way to pay for it. Because when you submit this proposal, and particularly when you submit this budget section, you're saying, we can execute this program or this project at this cost. And if you can't, here's where it can hurt you in the long run. You may try to do the program on the cheap, but usually your performance will suffer. So usually we tell folks, ask for what you need. If the funding is not sufficient, then you may have to look at additional funders that can support that program. But you always ask for what you need, and the budget's there to detail those particular costs. Here's the budget development process in particular. It's just really trying to identify the overall costs, arranging a category, and then enter the information in the format that they request. Most funders will have a format that they will give you. If they don't have a format, you can use your own. However, I strongly recommend you use Excel. It will make your life easier, and it'll make it easier when they review it. I've seen some folks place budgets in Word documents. I don't recommend this. particularly as your program becomes more complex and you have more budget line items. Because as you change, then you'll have to try to make the adjustments on that particular piece. I saw there was one question that put there, and the question was they're shocked in terms of sustainability not being one of the things they're looking for a budget. Again, keep this in mind. All funders want to know that your projects are sustainable, but you're not going to reflect that in a budget. The budget is generally only going to say, here's what I'm going to spend for this particular program or this particular project. In your program narrative, there'll always be a section, generally nowadays, that's asking, when these dollars are expended, where will we find the additional resources to continue this program? But for that particular funder, they're only concerned about what they have to fund right now. So that's why those are the three criteria that they're looking for. It's not that it's important, but it's basically them saying that wherever the money's coming from, that's on you to find that one. We're just interested in figuring out how we need to pay for what you're doing right now. Once you kind of figure out what you want to do, and we're looking more so at an organizational budget, you arrange your items by category. And this is a pretty good format that you can use in terms of your revenue and in terms of your expenses. If you have a CPA or accountant that you're working from, then chances are you're already going to have an organizational budget for the year. And they're generally just going to want to ask for a copy of it. But if you don't have one, these are some general categories that you can use. And it all boils down to is what are your revenues coming from and what expenses do you have as an organization? In terms of what we need to capture in a budget for a particular project, let's kind of break down the different elements and let you know what needs to be included to get the maximum points. The first one is personnel. And what I want you to keep in mind with the personnel, these are the hired staff or employees of your organization. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about personnel. We're not talking about contracted individuals or consultants or anything else like that. We're talking about the individuals that your organization hires. And in a budget, they're always reflected as personnel. And with this particular part, what you need to include, you need their titles, their names if you have them, and more importantly, what their annual salary is and what percentage of their effort they'll be using. And actually, when you think about that, and this will lead to our next question, our next poll question. There's a certain number that you need to have seared in your brain whenever you're doing a budget with personnel. And here's what we're talking about. Personnel time, when you're calculating a budget, is always going to be a proportion of a certain number. And let's launch this poll so you can see what we're talking about. Personnel time, when we're calculating it for the purposes of a budget, is always going to be a proportion of a certain number. And if you get this number seared in your head, it makes it much easier whenever you do personnel costs. You have the poll. What's that number? Okay, with about a little less than a third of the folks already voting for the poll, we're almost at a 50-50 split between two numbers in this poll. All right, with the majority of you voting, it looks like the majority of you said either 40 or 2080, with a few folks saying 80 or 365. Let me explain these numbers to you in particular. The number which you need to have in your brain is 2080. 2080 is always the billable number of hours in a year for an average full-time employee. So anytime you do a proportion, whether it's halftime or quarter time or 10%, it's always going to be a percentage of 2,080. Again, 2,080 is the number of billable hours for a full-time employee for a year. So if someone's halftime, they're going to work 1,040 hours. If they're work 10% of the time or they're a 10% employee, then it's going to be 208 hours. So that's the number you absolutely have to keep in your mind as you're doing personnel, because their effort, whether they're, particularly if they're a part-time employee, is always going to be a percentage of that 2,080. So get that number down on the inside and make sure you have it down pat. We're talking about fringe. Again, if the budget would allow for, and most will, it's always going to be your non-wage compensation. And these are things such as local, state, and federal taxes, FICA, if you offer vacation or leave time, or insurances. Generally, two numbers to keep in mind, because a lot of times folks will say, well, how much should I have for fringe? Well, generally, Social Security is usually going to be about 12.3%, and Medicare is going to be about 2.9%. The rest of it is actually trying to figure out what is the cost of your local taxes. And in DC, by the time you get done with your fringe, and this is not including vacation or sick leave time, you're usually somewhere in the range of 23 to 25%. That's on average. Again, if your organization has other things such as group insurances, tuition reimbursement, vacation and sick leave, then you may have a higher fringe rate. But you want to reflect it, and when you use a budget, you always want to show exactly what went into your fringe. The one thing to keep in mind is if your fringe rate exceeds 35%, then you're going to have to provide a listing of the benefits that are included, because that's considered a very high fringe rate. Ballpark fringe rate use is being somewhere between 23 to 25% on average, but it may fluctuate. But it's always a good idea to show the funder exactly where you calculated your fringe from. Also in your budget, and this goes for your expenses, or what we call other direct costs, or also known as ODCs. And again, the best way to keep in mind, these are the things you need to run your program. Supplies, marketing, meeting expenses, phone, equipment, travel, evaluation, project space. These are the kinds of things that will be included. And actually, evaluation may also fall under contracted services, depending on who does them. But if these things are in-house, then you're looking at your general categories being supplies, marketing, meeting, etc. One distinction I do want to make: if you're dealing with the federal government in particular, equipment is considered an item that costs $5,000 or more. If it's under $5,000, it's generally going to be categorized as a supply. And we're talking about things such as desktops, laptops, projectors. Those still fall under the supply category. If I was to get a piece of equipment, such as a heavy duty copier machine, that may fall under equipment. Or if I was doing, let's say, a job training program and working in the restaurant industry, if I bought some restaurant equipment, that would fall under equipment. But again, for the purposes of the federal government, and actually some other funders looked at the same way, equipment is considered $5,000 or more, and we're talking about per item. If it's less than that, it's generally going to fall under office supplies. And also with travel, if you're going to do travel, and you'll see it in a few slides down, you always want to use the federal per diem if you're looking at lodging and meals. In terms of mileage, same thing. There's a federal mileage rate, and you always want to make sure you reflect that in your budget. That's one of the first things that folks look at in terms of a cost that needs to be justified. And if your travel cost is high without justification, then it looks like you're basically taking your vacation on someone else's dime. And you never want anyone to think about that. So again, for all of these, you want sufficient detail, but with the travel in particular, you want to break that down and say exactly what it's for. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. In terms of other costs, and this tends to be professional contractual services, then we're talking about fees paid to individuals for a specific service. And this could be consultants, subcontracts, or contracted services. With consultants, if you're contracting out individuals to do a majority of the work of your project or doing a significant portion of your project work, pay special attention to IRS Revenue Ruling 8741. This is huge because in terms of the IRS, there's a demarcation between a consultant and either a part-time or full-time employee. And the main reason being tax purposes. Because as you're probably already aware, if you hire a consultant, they're responsible for their own taxes as well as usually their own benefits. So that means that there's no required employee match or employee contribution for taxes. However, in the terms of the IRS, and this is where I've seen a number of organizations get in trouble, and we're talking about severe trouble with the IRS, is for the IRS purposes, if the person looks like an employee, acts like an employee, and it appears to do the work of an employee, then they'll consider that employee if you don't pass the criteria for what it means to be a consultant. And we're talking about things such as they actually have a contract with you to do specific work. They can work with other entities besides your organization. They actually submit an invoice. There's 20 criteria that they use. And if you're unclear on whether or not your contracted position looks like an employee to the IRS, then it behooves you to contact them first. If you go talk to them first, they will work with you. If they come to you, game over. And if they come to you, they're going to be looking for back taxes and penalties. And I've seen some organizations shut down just because they confused a consultant with a part-time employee. So pay special attention to this piece if you're using consultants to do project work. Because if it looks like an employee, then you could have potential negative ramifications down the road. Subcontracts just means that basically, when reflecting this is when us doing work. And then contracted services, again, things that you just may not do. But these are the items that should be reflected in your professional contractual services section. As far as your indirect rate, and if they will allow for an indirect rate for your particular proposal, then these are items that can be included. Utilities, executive management, human resources, fiscal. Again, all the things you need to run a project or program, but not necessarily in your program. And again, it just depends on if the funder will pay for your overhead or your indirect rate. If you're dealing with the federal government or the district, then a lot of times what you will need to do is you'll need to establish a negotiated rate with the federal government. And what that is, whether you've had contact with the General Services Administration or the contracting portion of a federal agency, you'll work with them to calculate your overhead rate. I always tell folks, do this well, and if you want to engage an accountant or CPA, this is the time to do so. Because once you negotiate that indirect rate, you are locked in at that rate for a period of time. And during that period of time, if inflation happens or life happens, you are still locked in that rate. But the great thing is once you have that rate, you can use it at any federal agency. So even though you establish the indirect rate or negotiated rate with one federal agency, you can use it across the board with any other federal agency. And in most instances, you can also use that federal negotiated rate for the district as the district allows for overhead. If you haven't calculated that, and they'll still allow you to have your overhead, this is again where you go to your organizational budget. And you'll look at the particular cost that we listed here in terms of items that are included in your overhead. And again, you'll just work with your accountant in terms of justifying a cost and what it actually is. But these are the items that you would include in there. So again, these reflect your indirect cost, and you would just look at your last year or your last couple of years and then come up with a proportion of these that was what it cost to run your organization. In terms of budgets, anytime you're doing a federal budget for a project, these are the categories they're looking for. It went personnel, fringe, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, construction, and other. 2 words of caution. For the most part, unless you're doing a capital project, and most federal funders are not necessarily going to pay for that, you're not going to really have construction. Other, that is a tricky category if you're going to use that. If something doesn't cleanly go under contractual or supplies, even if you put it under other, you need to justify it clearly. And that's mainly because anything that's miscellaneous or other appears to be something that could be padded. So again, I really want to caution you, if you use the other category, that you put a justification for it. There was a question about the negotiated rate, and does it guarantee that all funders will honor it? If you have a negotiated rate with the federal government, any agency within the federal government and usually district agencies will honor that negotiated rate. If a foundation allows you to have overhead or indirect rate, then they will generally honor that because they realize that you had to negotiate with this. So they looked at it, they said it was fine. Generally, your fiscal people said it was fine as well. So they tend to honor that. I will let you know one particular thing. If a foundation allows for you to have overhead, they may cap the amount that they're willing to pay for, and that may not be your rate. If the foundation is capped at a certain rate, in terms of they say we're only going to pay for 11% overhead, or we're only going to pay 13% overhead, then even if you do have a higher overhead rate, you're not going to be able to get above that with a foundation. But generally, a public agency will let you have your negotiated rate. And a lot of times folks will ask me, what's a great rate in terms of getting an indirect rate? I always tell folks, on average, you're looking at 7 to 9%. If you can get 9 to 12% as an indirect rate, you are doing great. Generally, once you get higher than that, you're looking at either you're a university or a hospital or some other institution like that. One of the questions that came up was, where do you get a negotiated rate for your organization? Again, you're going to get this usually from a federal agency. The General Services Administration, the GSA, is generally where most people go to begin to negotiate their federal rate, their indirect or negotiated rate. But the contracting entity of most agencies, so whatever agency you're engaging with, there's always going to be a contracting office. You'd work with them to actually develop your negotiated rate. So whether it is the Center for Disease Control, the Administration for Child and Family Services, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, the Department of Labor, all of those agencies are going to have contracting offices within their agency. And you'll work with those contracting offices to develop your negotiated rate. And once you develop that rate, you can use that across the board at any agency. Okay, great. Those were very good questions. Let's keep going because we talked about the budget. And now we've got to spend a little bit of time talking about the budget justification. And again, really, this is just an explanation of what your costs really are. And these explanations should focus on each budget item that you need. And when you have a detailed budget, all items in the budget have to be justified. This is one of the times I say there are no guesstimates. This is simply you're showing exactly what you're spending for what. And we'll break it down for each section so I can let you know exactly what kind of things they're looking for. If they're looking in personnel for the budget justification section, again, they're going to want the name of the individual. And if you don't have an individual in mind, then you can usually put to be announced or to be hired. And usually they're okay for that with that. But you're definitely going to give the title that they're going to have on this project. And again, this title should reflect on what they're doing in this project. No other role in their life. And the reason I mention this, I've seen a lot of times folks would engage a university and they may hire someone on their staff. So on the project, they may be a project coordinator or a project manager or whatever it may be, but they list their university title. That is not what they're looking for. They want the title on this particular project. They also want to know the amount of effort being devoted to this project. And again, is it full-time? Is it 75% part-time employee, 50% part-time employee, whatever it may be? They want to know specifically the title and the amount of effort that you need for this person. And in the justification sentence, There's always going to be a brief description of the responsibilities in relation to this project. So again, if they're the project director, then you're basically going to say the project director who provides oversight, that meets with the project officer, that makes sure the evaluation takes place. You only need one or two sentences, but it should explain why you need this person. Of course, you had a section in your project, the organizational capability section, that talks about this to a degree. And you can just pull a line or two from there, but just one or two lines that explains again why you need this person on this project. As far as travel, the bus, and actually what we're doing right now, we're just going down the lines of a federal budget. In terms of the budget justification for travel, again, why you need to do this travel in the first place. When reviewers look at budgets and they look for padding or things that can be cut, travel is usually one of the first places that they go. And it's mainly because folks usually do a horrible job of justifying why they need this travel, one. And two, folks are so concerned based on things they've seen in the media that someone's taking their anniversary trip or their vacation on the funder's dime. So if you're going to put travel in your budget, then you want to specify the number of trips, where they're going, how many folks are going, and the exact cost. And again, you see the example right there. Airfare, lodging, the number of nights, per diem for for whatever number of days. And that's usually a good way. And it may be something as simple as training on such and such intervention for this project. A lot of times, if you're dealing with the federal government, they may require travel in there because there may be an annual meeting or training that they may require. Even if they require it, and make sure you look at the RFP closely so you can make sure you include those costs. Because if you don't, you're going to have to come out of pocket for it. But this is a pretty good format. And anytime you do travel, you always want to use the federal per diem. And that's for mileage as well as meals and lodging. And if you're not sure where you can find those numbers, again, gsa.gov/per diem, and it'll list all the rates by city. And that's something you have to keep in mind. Those rates change depending on what city you go to. So I can guarantee you, if you say you're taking a trip to a certain city, for wherever it may be, the reviewer is going to look at the per diem and make sure that it matches what it should be. If not, you put yourself into severe jeopardy. Equipment, and again, these are items that are over $5,000. And again, they want you to specify the type of equipment, and if you know it, the model and vendor name. For example, if you're getting a heavy duty copier, it may be, and I'm just throwing the Xerox 10,000, whatever model. But either way, you're going to explain what it is, the model number, and the vendor name, and why you need to purchase this equipment to do this project. Equipment gets kind of dicey with funders, so you want to make sure you justify why you need this. Because otherwise, people think, or reviewers think, I'm just trying to buy things for my organization on the funder's dime. Well, here's something you need to keep in mind, particularly if you're dealing with a federal funder. Even though you are in possession of the equipment is still the property of the federal government. So please keep that in mind. And a lot of times they'll spell that out in your contract agreements. Okay, I think we have a hand up. With that hand, if you could just put down in chat what your question is, and I'll make sure I answer it. Okay, we'll keep moving. In terms of supplies, and again, these are all non-permanent disposable supplies, such as office supplies, computer supplies, software. They all fall into this category. And you're looking at items that cost less than $5,000. If you're going to list supplies, then you want to do a general overview of what you're looking for. And actually, we had a question about travel and travel for project participants. This falls under, again, what's allowable. So if you're going to travel participants, the first thing you need to do is look closely at the RFP and make sure that the RFP will pay for that type of travel. If so, then you're still going to follow the same kind of information in terms of here are the number of individuals. You may have 15 youth that you take on a trip every year. Then you just want to say that 15 program participants, where they're going, and what is the cost. And you want to break that down. Because generally, once you make the purchases, if you're flying them somewhere, the air travel is going to be about the same. The lodging is going to be about the same. And if you're not sure, this is a great time to use one of those travel sites and say, here's what the cost is. You just want to be able to justify it. So it's fine to use travel project participants as long as they allow for it. But again, you have to justify the cost. And you have to show why the travel is necessary for the project. If it's something in terms of enhances their experience, they'll probably allow that. If I'll leave it this way. Judge it by the funder. And a lot of times the RFP will let you know what they will and are not willing to pay for. If you're not sure, then you definitely want to ask the program officer somewhere during the RFP process in terms of, is this an okay cost? For the supplies, while you do want to list general things such as we'll need, cell phones or we'll need laptops, you don't have to get as specific as saying 500 paper clips, 2 binders. That's not necessary. And the only reason I'm saying that is because I've seen that in many a project budget. They want detail, but you don't have to get that specific. But in terms of your office supplies, if you mention things such as here's a monthly cost or an annual cost that covers things such as paper, pens, paper clips, then usually they're fine with that. So you want to list things that you need, but you don't have to go all the way down to the pens and the paper clips. Okay, we had another question. Is there a formula for how supplies and equipment should be allocated? I believe that's the question. There's not necessarily a formula. It's really based on what you need because you're the one that's proposing this project to them. So you're basically telling them, I need certain resources to be able to execute this project. And the cost is just what the cost is. Now, they always want you to get the best rate that you can get. So that's okay. But there's not a specific formula per se. The only formulas that usually stick in place is sometimes folks will say there's only so much salary or personnel we want to spend on the project, or there's only so much overhead. As long as you can justify why you need these supplies or why you need this equipment, then you're generally okay. And we'll get to some of those other things, such as for personnel, ballpark is, and we're usually dealing with foundations. They may say, we want to pay no more than 35% for personnel. We want the rest to go into other direct costs. Again, it varies by funder, so there's not a set one, but a best practice is try not to go above 35 or 40% of your project being staff. In terms of contractual, it's laid out again here. Again, if you're going to use a consultant or professional services, then you want to talk about who it is, what the expertise they're bringing to the project, and what their fee is, whether it's by the days, whether it's an hourly, or whether it's based on milestones or tasks, but you want to spell that out. With a subcontract, you basically want to state the name of the subcontracting organization and a brief justification of what they're going to be doing for the project. The great thing for you is even though you list a cost in this budget, you don't have to list their what we call a subrecipient budget. So even though they may take up $10,000 for your budget justification, you're just saying, here's what we're having them do, and here's how we came up with this number. But we don't necessarily need to put an additional budget in this overall budget. Some funders may ask for the subcontractor to submit an additional budget, but even this will not be necessarily reflected in your overall project budget, if that makes sense. Just a couple of things to keep in mind. The first one is if the funder gives you a format, then that's the format you want to use. We're going to make a particular spreadsheet available to you. And if your funder hasn't given you a format, there's one that we'll make available on the OPGS website within the upcoming week or so. And that will already have the formulas in it. And it's a particular budget that I've used for federal, district, and foundation grants. So it's effective. The formula is already calculated in there. All you need to do is change the line items or change the numbers. But if you decide to do your own budget, please, please, please use an Excel format. And more importantly, use a format that shows how you calculated your cost. For example, if you're doing your salary or your personnel, then you want to say this many hours at this many rate so they can see how you calculated that number. And if you use the sheet, the budget sheet we're going to make available to you, the calculations, the formulas will already be in there. You just have to add the actual calculation and detail your costs with actual numbers. Basically, do not guesstimate. And a surefire way for for a reviewer to see that you're guesstimating is if they see rounded numbers. If everything is 300, 200, 500, 700, 900, then it looks like you really didn't calculate anything. You plugged some numbers in there as best you could. And that screams, cut me. So you want to limit the use of rounded numbers. You want to get the specific cost if you can have them. And if you don't, then you still do not want to use rounded numbers. It's much better to put down 384 than it is to put down $400. Again, it just screams, I'm taking a guess at what this number is. And that's going to invite additional scrutiny into your budget. While you don't want to guesstimate, if you can help it, there may be some times where you're not exactly sure what a cost may be. And I'll give you a couple of strategies in terms of how you can find some of that out as well. GSA being a good source to look at in terms of what some things may cost. And again, what happens if you don't know how much to request? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. The first one is go look at their listing of previously funded projects and awards. Foundations generally have this. And a lot of times if you're dealing with district or federal agencies, you can actually go through their financial information and the contracting side and see what they paid for a similar project in the past. If it's a new project, they're generally going to give you a funding range, and you want to definitely stay within that range. I would definitely encourage you, if you're dealing with a foundation, look at what they paid and what they spent in the past. Because if you exceed that, chances are either you're going to get cut or you're not going to be included. If you don't see a listing, then go look at their annual report, because a lot of times they'll list what they paid, what they spent in their annual report. If they don't have an annual report, then you can actually pull a foundation's 990. And if you're not sure what a 990 is more or less the tax return for that agency. Every 501c3 has to do so nowadays, and foundations are included in this as well. If you're not sure where to get their 990, then you basically go to guidestar.org, GUIDE star.org. And if you go to GuideStar and you type in the name of the foundation, their 990 will pull up and you can see what they spent in the previous year. If you're dealing with a district or federal agency, then you're going to look at the budget for the previous year. And again, if it's a federal agency, you look basically on the contracting side and that will list that out. If it's a district agency, then you would go to the office of the chief financial officer and then you would pull the budget for that agency and just see what they spent in the previous year to get an idea of what they're probably going to spend this year. And the reason that tends to be effective is that large agencies only fluctuate so much. So if they spent it in the past, at least you know you're in the ballpark. So again, those are the 4 best ways to go about doing it. If you're still not sure, those 4 ways didn't work for you, you can ask your fellow nonprofit organizations, particularly folks that have already been previously funded. And this may work for you if they're not currently competing for that funding. If they are, you pretty much won't get a response. But if it's someone who has been funded and they're willing to talk to you, then you can talk to them. The last way you can go about doing it is make a Freedom of Information Act request or a FOIA. While this is available to you, I do not recommend this to be the first course of action in terms of getting this information. And it's mainly because if you filling a FOIA request is not, how can I put this? Put it this way, most agencies don't like to do this. So you will not make friends and influence people if you're sending out FOIA requests. Sometimes you may need to, but definitely try one of the other 5 methods first. And as an absolute last resort, if you need to do the FOIA, then you can do so. But understand, if you're in the middle of an RFP process, there's a very strong likelihood that you'll not get the information before that RFP process is completed. But those are a couple of things a few things you can do if you're not sure how much to ask for. A couple of budget must, and I'll leave these for you here. Just looking, because we won't go through every one in particular, but a couple of things I want you to keep in mind is you always want to look at the cost benefit ratio. And one of the things I always do as a reviewer is I ask myself, I look at the overall budget and I look at the number of participants, and I just simply divide the budget by the number of participants. For example, let's say you're asking for $100,000 and you have 100 participants. Well, I would divide those 100 into that $100,000, and basically what it boils down to is about $1,000 per participant. And the question I ask myself as a reviewer, would this participant be better served if I just cut a check and give them $1,000 and put them through your program? And I always use it as a rule of thumb or my litmus test for most things. I just flat out ask, would it be better served if I just cut the person a check and give it to them than putting them through your program? If you can pass that initial sniff test, you're usually in pretty good shape. If a reviewer looks at your project or your program and says, no, they're probably better off I just gave them a check and let them go about their business, then you generally know based on your narrative or based on your justifications, you are in trouble. The other part, again, in terms of your budget, and that's item number 5, your personnel costs should be no more than 35 to 40%, with about 60 to 65% going for program support. Again, this may fluctuate depending on whether or not they'll let you have overhead, but you generally want to stay within those guidelines. The other part, and I think I mentioned before, do not include a miscellaneous budget category. If you know what it is, put it under one of your other categories. Miscellaneous screams padding, or it screams my just in case money. Well, they're not interested in your just in case money. They want to know, what does it cost? And since this is your program, you should know this. I told you about the whole numbers, but as a caution to you, be careful if you put minimal costs for things such as letterhead, posters, photocopying, utilities, and the reason, or particular websites. If you build a website but you don't leave money in your budget for maintenance, these are the kind of items that tend to sneak up on folks because they don't account for the cost. And then when they execute the program, the costs are there and they absolutely have to find a way to pay for it. The other part, and most funders are going to mention this in the RFP, and it's in 7. If someone's already paying for something, another funder is not going to want to pay for that. That's what we call supplanting. And most of the times they'll tell you flat out, point blank, don't do it. Are there any questions? And we'll open this up again. If you have questions, just raise your hand and type it in chat, and we'll get to you as soon as we can. And again, we'll also make a budget spreadsheet available to you. And again, you can just plug information into that spreadsheet and go with that. One particular question that came up, does the inclusion of in-kind costs enhance your proposal? Generally, yes. As long as you can show what the costs were, and particularly if they're asking for a match, then it's absolutely necessary. If they're looking for a match, you always need to be careful if they're looking for a hard or a soft match. Hard match meaning cash, soft match meaning in-kind. But even if you do in-kind, just like you would do a regular budget cost, you want a justification. If you're saying, I have this much for the room, then you're saying, based on the square footage and our lease rate, then here's what we're charging. Or if someone's volunteering their time, how many hours and what is their worth per hour? And generally what you can do is you can look at there's 1 of 3 ways you can go about doing it if you're looking at individuals. You can take a proportion of their salary based on the number of hours they work. A lot of times, places also have a guide that lists the worth of a volunteer, and you can generally add that in as well. Okay. The other question was, how does the budgeting process work when you're collaborating with another nonprofit? Well, it's generally going to work about the same. And it goes back to that one portion we talked about, subcontracting. For every proposal written, there's always one agency that's going to be the lead. Or if you're dealing with contracting circles in the federal government, we also call them the prime. Generally, that is going to be the entity that the budget's going to go through. If that's the case, then the other agencies are going to have to create their own budgets and get them to you. You include those in your overall cost, and they'll usually be listed as a subcontract or vendor for your particular organization. And again, in your budget or the budget you'll submit to them, you're just going to list their overall cost. If the funder asks for their budgets, then you can give them to them, but they won't be reflected in the budget that you give the funder. It's almost like something you would put in an appendix section for the most part. But again, generally, there's always going to be one agency that's going to be the lead or the prime, and the budget goes through them. The other question that came up is, should you show non-confirmed revenue streams that might be paying for expenditures? Those are generally going to be reflected in an overall organizational budget. Now, if you're talking about this in terms of a project budget, then generally the only thing you can place down there is, and this is usually if you're looking at in kind, you're basically going to put down, we expect this amount from this specific foundation. Now, what's going to happen is if you get awarded, the funder's going to be looking for proof, and they're going to be making sure that you actually have this money in place when you get there. So you can list non-confirmed revenue for expenditures, but you best believe that if you get the award, there'll be some caveat in your contract award. They'll basically say, we'll be looking for proof after a certain period of time. And if it's not confirmed, you still want to say, this particular foundation for this particular amount to do this aspect of my program. You want to get that specific, even with the in-kind in your program budget. If you're talking organizationally, then it's just a matter of, here's the organization where we've seeking funding, and here's the amount, and that will be reflected in your organizational budget. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, right now, I don't see any additional questions, but one thing we do want to let you know, OPGS will be for an evaluation to all of you later this week. We're pleased asking you to complete this evaluation because it lets us know how we can improve this particular grant writing webinar. As many of you know, this is a pilot project that we're doing right now, and we want to make sure we can find ways to improve your experience. So when you get the evaluation, please take the time and let us know specifically what worked for you, and also what can be done to make this even better experience. And again, are there any additional questions? If not, it looks like we're at 5 o'clock. And again, I want to thank you for taking this journey with us. I hope this has been beneficial to you, and happy grant seeding. Take care.